comes from Luke chapter 16, verses 19 to 31. Listen for the word of God. Jesus said, "There was a certain rich man who was splendidly clothed in purple and fine linen, and who lived each day in luxury. At his gate lay a poor man named Lazarus, who was covered with sores. As Lazarus lay there, longing for scraps from the rich man's table, the dogs would come and lick his open sores. Finally, the poor man died and was carried by the angels to sit beside Abraham at the heavenly banquet. The rich man also died and was buried, and he went to the place of the dead. There, in torment, he saw Abraham in the far distance with Lazarus at his side. The rich man shouted, 'Father Abraham, have some pity. Send Lazarus over here to dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue. I'm in anguish in these flames.' But Abraham said to him, 'Son, remember that during your lifetime you had everything you wanted, and Lazarus had nothing. So now he is here being comforted, and you are in anguish. And besides, there is a great chasm separating us. No one can cross over to you from here, and no one can cross over to us from there.' Then the rich man said, 'Please, Father Abraham, at least send him to my father's home, for I have 5 brothers, and I want him to warn them, so they don't end up in this place of torment.' But Abraham said, 'Moses and the prophets have warned them. Your brothers can read what they wrote.' The rich man replied, 'No, Father Abraham, but if someone is sent to them from the dead, then they will repent of their sins and turn to God.' But Abraham said, 'If they won't listen to Moses and the prophet, they won't be persuaded even if someone rises from the dead.' Amen. Today's sermon, entitled One Family, will be delivered by Pastor Lakkis.
The grace and peace of Christ be with all of us today. I really love Taipei. Part of that is because I love living in big cities. I love the atmosphere that you get in a big city. All the activity, the culture, the mixture of different groups of people, everyone living together and contributing to something really wonderful and exciting. But over the years living here, I've noticed that the Taipei that I know and love is not necessarily the same Taipei that everyone else knows. Yes, we all live in the same city. We all live in this same physical place on the map. But the experiences that people have here in this same city can be so incredibly different. For example, every day out on the streets, I wander past houses which aren't quite the same as others. First of all, these houses tend to be really huge, or at least I assume they're huge, because second, I often can't actually see them. All I get to see usually is this big blank wall, this huge wall or a giant gate that blocks the house off from the outside world. Sometimes these walls have barbed wire around them. Sometimes they've got broken pieces of glass cemented to the top. And very often they'll have like 7 or 8 security cameras pointing at the gate. In the old days, when our family used to live at the church's seminary up on Yangmingshan, we would go past houses like this every day. We would joke with the kids that there must be really dangerous criminals living locked up behind those walls, because sometimes those properties really looked like prisons. But of course, it wasn't criminals living there at all. These were the mansions of people who were very, very wealthy. Now, let me say that I think it's great that people can enjoy the fruits of their hard work. There are many people who do spend their whole lives working hard to support their families, and it's good. It's good that they can enjoy their success in beautiful homes, in comfortable homes. There's nothing wrong with that at all. It's just sad that for some people, wealth can bring with it so much fear. For too many people, they feel like they can only enjoy that good life by hiding away, by hiding behind high walls, hiding behind cameras and barbed wire, and quite literally cutting themselves off from everyone else. I've spent time with very wealthy business people in Taipei who don't live like this at all, who live and work and enjoy normal life together with everyone else around them. But I have to confess that I also have friends who do live this type of cut-off life, living in houses cut off from the rest of the city, driven around in black cars with blacked-out windows, cut off from others on the street, moving around each day from a secured, walled-in house to a secured private car park at work, leaving after work to go to secured private clubs, and then returning at night to secured, walled-in homes. And I really feel that that's sad to see. It's a whole life that is technically lived here in Taipei, but doesn't really have much to do with the rest of the city at all. It's a life that's completely separated, a life that's completely divided off from everyone else around them. Of course, that type of mentality isn't just something that we see here in Taipei. We see it everywhere. We see it all around the world. And it's not a new problem either. Anyone who's ever traveled to Europe will have seen lots and lots of old castles from the Middle Ages. And many of those castles have these huge moats all around them. And moats were designed to do this same thing. They were designed with this same goal in mind, to keep people away, to keep outside people away, to stop anyone coming too close to the families living inside, to keep those families inside far away and far separated from everyone else. And even back in the time of Jesus, things were also much the same then too. And that's the theme that we see in today's Bible passage. In this story, in this parable that Jesus tells, we find a story about two people who lived very, very different lives, even though they lived in the same place. It's a story about two people whose lives were also separated by a great divide. A story about a rich man full of life and a poor man with absolutely nothing worth living for. These two people lived right next door to each other, right by each other. But their lives were completely separate, completely different. The rich man lived a life of fine luxury, eating well and dressing in soft linen and purple, the most expensive color you could buy in the ancient world. But the second man, that was a poor beggar, living a miserable life on the other side of this great divide. The way that Jesus describes it, this second man wasn't just poor. He lived a terrible, miserable life at the very edge of death. He's badly sick. He has nothing to eat. He doesn't even have the energy left to push the local stray dogs away when they come to lick his wounds. None of us would want to live that way. And for those poor people on the streets who first listened to Jesus tell this story so many thousands of years ago, for those poor people on the streets, they too would have loved to live like the rich man, not like the poor man. After all, that was a dream life for everyone. That was a dream life, to live a life of luxury, a life of easy food and wealth. Many of those ancient people listening to Jesus speak would have even thought that that rich man was someone who was really blessed by God, someone wonderfully blessed by God. And honestly, I think in our modern world, many of us still tend to think this way. Many of us still think that riches and wealth are a sign of God's blessing, a sign of God's love and favor, that God blesses those who are righteous and faithful, that God fills their lives with good things. In Jesus' day, people also thought that the opposite was true, that people who were suffering badly must be being punished in some way by God. The poor man in Jesus' story is suffering so much that maybe people thought he deserved it in some way. Maybe he'd done something to deserve such a terrible life. And Jesus really does lay on all of these negative descriptions, each one worse than the last. Not only is the man poor, he's also terribly sick. He's so weak he can't walk, he can't even sit up. He can only lie there helplessly on the ground with his entire body covered with sores. Surely Surely this person must have done something to deserve such a terrible life. Surely he must be cursed by God to be suffering so badly. Surely he must be being punished for something, some kind of hidden evil or hidden sin in his life. In the ancient world, people really felt this way. People really felt that a good life was a sign of God's love and blessing, while a life full of suffering must have been a sign of God's punishment. Maybe we would laugh at that idea today, but I wonder if our thinking has really changed that much. After all, don't we still admire the wealthy? Don't we still want to live like them? And don't we still look down on poor people living on the streets? Don't we still think that they must have done something wrong to be in that position? That they must be lazy or alcoholic or failures in some way, and they're just getting what they deserve? Jesus sets up this contrast here in this story, a contrast between rich and poor, a contrast between blessed and cursed, between the person that we would love to be and the person we would hate to be. But then, step by step, Jesus turns our thinking completely upside down here. At the very beginning of the story, Jesus starts by doing something incredibly strange, something we may not notice at first. Jesus tells us the poor man's name. And that's really odd. That's something really odd. Because that's not the way that the real world tends to be. Because in our world, it's the names of the rich and famous that we all know. We read about the rich and famous on the internet or in our magazines. We see them on TV. We even chat with our friends about them, or about what that movie star is doing, or about the latest romance that pop star is having. We've never met these people. We've never known them. We've never been on the street together with them. But somehow we all still know their names. I wonder if I had to put people's names up here. I don't think people need to know these names. We just know these people. It's odd that we do it. Madonna doesn't even need a surname. She just goes by one name. We've never met these celebrities, and yet we know their names. But we rarely ever know the names of the poor or the ordinary people living right next to us. And that makes us often think that it's only the rich and famous who are worth knowing. But here we see that the situation with Jesus is so different. In Jesus' story, it's the rich man who stays entirely nameless, entirely anonymous. But Jesus knows Lazarus by name. And I find that really wonderful. I find that really incredible, because it's a great reminder of where Jesus' priorities are. We live in a world where we are so often overlooked by others, precisely because people don't consider us to be very important. We're told every day that we aren't important. We aren't important enough to notice. We're not important enough to care about. Not even important enough for people to care about knowing our names. In a big city like Taipei, we just wander through life so anonymous, so ignored. And yet that's not the way it is with Jesus. No matter how small we are, no matter how ordinary our lives may be, Jesus knows each of us by name. We get used to being ignored in life. We get used to being treated like nobodies. We walk down the street knowing that no one else around us really cares much about us or what's going on in our lives. But again, that's not true with Jesus. That's not true with Jesus. We aren't nameless nobodies to him. Jesus knows each one of us by name. He knows what we're going through, and he really does care what's happening in our lives. For those people who were first listening to Jesus tell this story, maybe it was strange for them too that Jesus knew the name of this poor and unimportant person, that Jesus knew Lazarus by name. But the story is about to get even stranger, because suddenly both men die, and it's at this point that the people listening to Jesus must have felt that Jesus has suddenly gotten this story really very, very wrong. Because for those ancient listeners, Lazarus was the one who was suffering. He was the one who was clearly unclean and miserable, clearly being punished by God for something in his life. And so it made sense to think that if he died, what was waiting for him after death would also be something horrible and terrible. On the other side of the great divide, the rich man was the one who seemed to be so blessed by God, living so comfortably, living in such wealth. So surely when they both die, it will be the rich man who's carried off to paradise, while Lazarus goes to suffer for whatever his hidden earthly sins must have been. But here Jesus turns our expectations completely upside down. Lazarus, the one who is poor, unclean, and a failure, he's the one who gets welcomed into Abraham's arms. And the rich man, the one people admired so much, the one people thought of as so blessed, he suddenly finds himself suffering in flames. Jesus makes it clear that the normal way people judged others, the normal way people looked at others, by looking at their outward lives, by using wealth to judge whether they're blessed or not, that doesn't work with God. God doesn't judge us in the same ways. People, even today, assume that the rich are blessed and loved by God, whereas the poor are punished and rejected. But Christ turns that thinking upside down completely and shows us that it's precisely the poor, the unholy, the weak, the needy, it's them that God reaches out to and cares for. And that's really great news. But Jesus' hearers must have been so confused by this, because that wasn't how they understood the world to work at all. Jesus' story is really full of these reversals, full of these huge and unexpected changes between the way we assume life works and the way God sees it, between who we think of as great and blessed and who God cares for the most. And there's a great reversal between this life and the next life too, for our two main characters. We watch as everything changes for Lazarus. The suffering that he went through gets changed and reversed in the next life. And what an amazing result that is. But interestingly, not everything here changes. Not everything in this story has a reversal. For the rich man, yes, after death, his situation was also reversed from one of easy and uncaring luxury to one of terrible suffering. But notice that not everything has changed for him. Two things in particular stay very much the same for the rich man. First, during his life, the rich man lived a life of separation. He lived a separated life, a separated existence, purposefully disconnected, purposefully far away from everyone else, especially from those in need. And now, in the next life, to his horror, he finds that separation is still there. That separation that he loved so much in life is still there. That separation that he set up for himself in life has followed him into death. Sadly, that's not the only thing in the story that hasn't changed, because second, Jesus makes it clear that even in the flames of the afterlife, the rich man still hasn't seemed to have learnt anything. During life, the rich man lived a life of entitlement. He was used to getting everything that he wanted. During life, he was used to commanding others around, to bossing them around and having them obey his wishes. And now, after death, that type of self-important attitude and mentality is still there. The rich man is in flames and in torture, but even there, he still thinks he has the power somehow to boss other people around. He literally shouts at Abraham, "Send that Lazarus over here to give me something to drink." Even in death, the rich man tries to treat poor Lazarus like a slave to be bossed around and commanded. But the rich man's power to command others is gone. His power to force others to do what he wants is gone. In any case, as Abraham points out, there would be no way for Lazarus to get to him. In this life, the rich man built his own private existence, cut off from everyone around him. He separated himself from others. He built a huge barrier to keep the rest of the world outside and away. And now, after death, that great divide that he has made himself is still there. It makes us wonder if the rich man in the story ever really understood that he did this to himself. He'd done this all to himself. That no one can reach him now because he spent his whole life building barriers to keep others away. But that shocking sense of entitlement and self-importance doesn't even end there. Realizing that all hope for him is over, the rich man suddenly pleads with Abraham, pleads for the lives of his 5 brothers. Maybe we feel like here the rich man is finally learning something, finally thinking about others. But here too, he still doesn't quite get it. Because he still has this same attitude, this same mentality of entitlement. Here too, he again tries to treat Lazarus as a slave, as someone to be bossed around, as someone to be sent out on errands, as someone who should go and serve the rich man and his family. He shouts those words out to Abraham over that great divide. Send Lazarus. I want him to go to my 5 brothers. Get Lazarus to convince my brothers to change their lives. This time, Abraham's response is short and direct. They've got Moses and the prophets. Let your brothers listen to them. I think it's always interesting how quickly we see people throw tantrums when they don't get what they want. And here the rich man is not very different. He immediately shouts back at Abraham again and yells at him, "No, you're wrong. That's not going to work." He actually argues with Abraham. No, that message in the Bible isn't good enough. That message in the Bible, that message from Moses and the prophets is not good enough for my family. Maybe if it was good enough, I wouldn't be in this situation. Maybe that message is good enough for other people, but it sure wasn't good enough for me because I ended up in this place. And it won't be good enough for my brothers either. So we notice here how he still has this attitude, this approach of entitlement and self-importance. The rich man actually blames God for his situation, for ending up in those flames. It's God's fault. That's what he feels. It's God's fault that he's in Hades now, because as far as the rich man sees it, God didn't try hard enough to convince him of the truth. After all, maybe in life the rich man had always gotten something a little bit extra. Had gotten some extra attention, gotten extra service, gotten some extra care. So surely God should have also offered an extra type of special exclusive salvation package just for him too. A special miraculous message. A special miraculous message of salvation just for the important and elite. As far as the rich man is concerned, he and his brothers aren't like common people. And so God should organize a special path of salvation just for them. A special handwritten invitation carried by dead Lazarus himself to hand over to those who, in their own eyes, are too special to accept faith in the same way as everyone else. Now, I think it's easy to make fun of this character. I think it's easy to make fun of the rich man here for his sense of entitlement and self-importance. But I think that's precisely the point. I think Jesus wants us to see how ridiculous this behavior is. But the really scary thing is realizing that we often act in this exact same way. How many times do we hear other people say these types of things? Or how many times have we said that ourselves? Have we ourselves made these same demands of God, saying things like, "Oh, I would believe in God if only God would give me some miraculous sign. If God really wanted me to believe in him, then he should do something extra to impress me. He should speak to me in a loud voice from heaven. He should show me some kind of miracle. He should even send someone from the dead to convince me. Maybe then I would consider believing." And in these ways, we act in that same way. We act in just as an entitled and self-important way as the rich man in the parable. The normal way to faith has been good enough for billions of other people throughout all history. But it's easy for us to fall into the trap of thinking that that's simply not good enough for you and me. Instead, we demand that God gives us a personalized and exclusive invitation, a miraculous sign just for us. In our self-centeredness, we demand that God reorder the whole universe, create special miracles, overturn the laws of nature, and honestly try a little bit harder to impress us before we'll consider believing in him. But as we see with the rich man in the parable, that's an incredibly wrong attitude for us to take. The path to faith that has been good enough for everyone else is good enough for us too. But the really frightening bit of the story is still to come. At the end of Jesus' parable, we feel a little bit sorry for the rich man because he almost made it. He almost figured it out. He almost thought about someone else, someone other than just himself. In the end, his last thought wasn't just for himself, but for his 5 brothers. And that's a good step. But the problem is that even here at the very end of the rich man's story, we find that he failed to really grasp it, really understand. The rich man didn't just have 5 brothers to care about. He had 6, because Lazarus was a brother too. The rich man never realized that Lazarus was also someone that he should have been caring about too. That Lazarus was someone that he should have reached out to in care and compassion. Lazarus wasn't just a poor nobody. As Jesus makes clear, Lazarus was also a son of Abraham, just like the rich man was. Lazarus wasn't worthless. He was also a son of God, just like the rich man was. And that's the lesson that the rich man never quite grasped. That we are all part of this one same family. That we are all brothers and sisters together. No matter what our financial situation is, no matter what our social status is, we are all children of God. And we should all be looking out for each other, all caring for one another. And that's the real lesson that Jesus wants to teach us here in this story. Jesus sets up this very simple story in this very simple way. Jesus sets up this story in this simple way with the rich man on one side and the poor Lazarus on the other. But I think this simple setup to this story can trick us. It can trick us into thinking that you have to be rich to make these types of mistakes. The dangerous thing is that that's not true at all. The problems and the mistakes we see the rich man making in this parable are not just mistakes that rich people make. These are problems that all of us face. Why does Jesus tell us this parable? Yes, it teaches us about the dangers of an attitude of self-importance and entitlement. Yes, it teaches us never to simply assume that the rich are blessed by God while the poor are somehow being cursed by God. And yes, it teaches us that Christ has a preferential option for the poor, that God focuses most on caring for the poor and needy. But the most important reason that Jesus tells us this parable is to teach us that it's not too late for us to do the same. It's not too late for us to care for those around us. It's not too late for us to also reach out to those around us who need help. That's the real point here. Not whether you're rich or poor, but how we treat one another. That's the real point. Because you don't need to be rich to separate yourself off from others. You don't need to be rich to disconnect your life from others. You don't need to be rich to not care about those around you. It's a mistake all of us make. But the good news is that it's never too late for us to change that behavior. And that's what Jesus wants us to learn. That's the point he wants us to learn. It's never too late for us to stop ignoring each other. It's never too late for us to start really treating each other as sisters and brothers, as part of the one same family. Jesus just hopes we can learn that lesson while we're still here in this life, before we get to the next. Let's pray together. Our Lord Christ, thank you for your incredible love for us. You know each one of us by name, and you care for us and support us. Please send your Spirit to touch our lives and to help us to grow more like you. Help us not to hide behind walls in our life, but to reach out to others in the same way that you reach out to us, to see others the same way that you see us, as brothers and sisters together in the one same family, in your holy family. In your holy name we pray.